I'm Teisha Bader with Shalom TV's news update for Tuesday, August the 20th, 2013. 2 Israeli soldiers were injured and 1 Palestinian was killed during clashes early this morning in the West Bank city of Jenin. The IDF spokeswoman said that IDF forces were conducting a pre-dawn raid in a refugee camp in Jenin in order to arrest Bassam Saadi, a senior member of Islamic Jihad suspected of being involved in terror activity. The IDF entered Saadi's home and conducted a search and were attacked by Palestinian locals who threw bottles and stones at them. The security force fired tear gas and rubber bullets in return. The IDF spokeswoman said that live fire was exchanged during the clashes on both sides. She added that Palestinians shot live fire at the Israeli security force and threw explosives at them, but she couldn't say more about which side had first used the live fire. 2 Israeli soldiers were lightly injured during the exchange and 1 Palestinian man was killed. He is Majid Lalu, and conflicting reports give his age as 17 or 22. The Associated Press reports that Israeli and Palestinian negotiators were conducting their second round of peace talks today. The AP cited a Palestinian official who is, quote, close to the negotiations, who wouldn't comment on where the reported talks were taking place, but French news agency AFP reported that they took place in Jerusalem. The Palestinian official spoke on the condition of anonymity as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry had asked both sides not to talk about any details of the negotiations with the media. The AP also quoted Israeli Justice Minister Tzipi Livni, who is serving as chief negotiator for Israel, saying that Israel will make dramatic decisions to reach a final peace agreement that will end the conflict with the Palestinians. Livni also said that right-wing members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition are making her job more difficult. And staying with Israel's Justice Minister, Tzipi Livni has appointed Professor Ruth Gavison, a former Israel Prize winner, to draft a constitutional provision defining what it means for Israel to be a, quote, Jewish and democratic state. In Livni's address to Gavison, she said, "I believe that the time has arrived to draft a constitutional framework that deals with the character of the State of Israel as Jewish and democratic, and anchors the components of the identity in a balanced way, integrating these values, the Jewish and the democratic." The appointment follows several controversial legal and social issues that have arisen in the country. Gavison was one of the founders of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and she served as a senior associate of the Israel Democracy Institute. She was awarded the Israel Prize for her work and study in the field of legal research in 2011. In the latest of several inflammatory remarks about Israel, Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan today accused Israel of being behind Egypt's military takeover. Erdogan was quoted in the Turkish daily Today's Zaman as saying, "Israel is behind the coup in Egypt. We have evidence." The Turkish premier cited a conversation he had with a, quote, French Jewish intellectual who predicted that the Muslim Brotherhood would not be permitted to rule in Egypt even if it won an election because, quote, democracy is not the ballot box. Erdogan has stirred controversy in the past with his anti-Israel remarks, including likening Zionism to fascism. Meanwhile, according to a report in the Daily Beast, the U.S. government has decided to temporarily suspend most forms of military aid to Egypt, although it hasn't said publicly whether they regard the military takeover as a coup or not. United Nations Secretary General Ban KiMoon seems to be backpedaling on comments he made last week about the UN's bias against Israel. While in Jerusalem last Friday, Ban reportedly told students he was meeting with at the UN's headquarters in Jerusalem that there is bias against Israel at the UN, quoted by several media sources as saying, "Unfortunately, because of the conflict, Israel has been weighed down by criticism and suffered from bias, sometimes even discrimination." However, yesterday, a reporter for Israel Radio pressed Ban about those comments during a press event at the UN headquarters in New York, where the Secretary General seemed to retract them. Ban answered the reporter saying, "I don't think there is discrimination against Israel at the United Nations," further saying the Israeli government maybe raised this issue that there's some bias against Israel, but Israel is one of the 193 member states, thus Israel should have equal rights and opportunities without having any bias, any discrimination. That's a fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter, and thus Israel should be fully given such rights. At the same press event, Ban also called the renewed peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians a fresh and historic opportunity for real progress, and called on both leaders to seize it. Registration began yesterday for the Union for Reform Judaism's 72nd North American Biennial. The Jewish gathering, said to be the largest in North America, will take place this December the 11th through the 15th in San Diego. It will bring together 5,000 Jewish lay leaders, professionals, youth, congregants, and clergy to learn, pray, share ideas, and make decisions about the future of Jewish life. And for the first time, the biennial is open to those outside the Reform movement. Biennial Chair Edward Berger said when we opened up the proposals for our learning sessions, we received more than 500 proposals, many of which came from beyond our synagogues and institutions. We know we have much to learn from those outside our movement, and we are confident that we have much to offer them as well. Berger said that as a result of the shared biennial experience, the URJ anticipates a greater level of awareness and collaboration throughout the entire North American Jewish community. Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, Malcolm Hoenlein, was initiated as a brother of Alpha Epsilon Pi last week in a ceremony at New York's Waldorf Astoria. The fraternity is the International Jewish Brotherhood, and last week's ceremony marked the 100th anniversary of its founding at NYU in 1913. Hoenlein praised the work and commitment of the fraternity at the event, in particular mentioning the programs Jenin, which is a 2-day seminar on Jewish identity, and Israel Amplified, a 2-day Israel advocacy training course for campus leaders. Several other community leaders were honored at the gala as well, including the Consul General of New York, Ido Aharoni. And that's Shalom TV's news update for Tuesday, August the 20th, 2013. I'm Teisha Bader.